instead of stepping back, what we began to do is appoint unqualified people to leadership roles, which had an impact over time. So this is where we wound up at. We crashed. Not only did we crash, we crashed and burned. And I can chuckle at that slide now, but 8 years ago that was very painful. It was devastating to us. It was devastating to me to literally see our pastor throw his hands up in the air and say, "I've had it." To see the questions on people's faces, to confront my own questions, to ask, what are we doing? What have we done? Go ahead, Scott.
One of the things that, what was going on from my point of view at that time, is that I was beginning to sense that through some of my encounters with then the youth pastor, Brian Todd, because I was working very closely with him on some other irrelated things, but I began to sense his heart, and I began to see what he was already investing in the youth and how he was pulling that off in a very miraculous, successful way, and that the heart of his ministry was not around programs, even though there was many in that particular area. The heart of his ministry was investing in people. And I'd always been of the mind that the three key ingredients that any church really needs to be concentrating on are some form of what we're now calling a life group or a small group, and also some accountability, and finally some discipleship in the form of what we would now refer to as counseling. And I'd seen those kind of elements really important in terms of how you get people to essentially not sign up to programs and being involved in things versus being involved in, like, who am I in God and what is my ministry? What do I have to give to the next, not only the next generation, but to God in my community and all that. And I began to sense that Brian was very much devoted to those kinds of things. So in the midst of all these things, and this is very scriptural too, it seems like how many times do we sense that God will essentially allow man to build up these great edifices, thinking full, and completely that this is the right thing. He's doing the right work, and he really is. He's committed completely to the calling that he thinks God has allowed him to perform. But then God tests it and makes it come crashing down, and then out of those ashes rises the work that God wants to do. And this is exactly what was happening, in almost formulaic. This is what was happening at Burl Naz, is that here we were in a situation where we had all these success stories from the world's eyes. We were really a happening congregation that was really doing a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, it was not necessarily investing in the people in the right way, and so it was like a house of cards that eventually was going to come down. And God was now going to rebuild this ministry His way instead of the way in which we had thought.
And so that really reflects, those bullet points there really reflect where we were at and what happened. We couldn't sustain the pace. People started leaving the church. Our senior pastor resigned. The groups both small groups and the support groups that we had established just folded. We couldn't sustain it. We couldn't sustain the pace. We couldn't sustain the weight. I don't know how many of you, probably most of you, have never heard of people express it. It's probably not a good analogy because of your relative age. But there was an airline many years ago in the 80s that's called People Express, and it was one of the first discount, if not the first major discount airlines, and they just grew phenomenally. and then all of a sudden they crashed. And the reason they crashed is because they didn't have the infrastructure to support their growth. And that's exactly what happened to us. And so where we found ourselves was here. No, it's not. There we are. I don't know what that looks like to you, but what it looks like to me is a wilderness. And that's where we were. We had no pastor. There were a number of pastors on our district who were very interested in being our pastor. But we just couldn't seem to land on anyone. And at the same time, we had the youth pastor who Scott referenced, who initially resigned, and out of a protocol, but who began, after some entreaties from several people on the board, began to consider whether he would actually be interested in being senior pastor. To make a long story short, he is now, and has been for the last 7 years, the senior pastor of the church. And one of the interesting, from my vantage point at least, one of the interesting dynamics is he's probably 15 to 20 years younger than the average congregant, which was a reason, I think one of the reasons why it was not an overwhelming vote in our church to call him. And he even wrestled with whether he would accept the call after it was extended, because it was close to a borderline vote. We were in the wilderness. And it seemed like no matter what we did, we couldn't get out of it. We were asking these questions, some of which I already referenced. What went wrong? Where's God? What do we do? How do we get out of this place? And it seemed like the more we wrestled, the more stuck we were. Isn't it? Some things that slide is, the heading on that slide should have read, and it's probably because the slide is too much crammed into the slide, but I want to talk about some things that we learned. And one of the things, I'd say the top thing we learned, that it is better spiritually to be 1 inch wide and 2 miles deep than it is to be 2 miles wide and 1 inch deep, which is how a number of us assess our previous condition. We had a lot going on, but as Scott referenced, we weren't investing in people. We weren't equipping people. We weren't really focusing on discipleship. We were focusing on perceived, felt needs. And while those are nice, God didn't call anybody to minister to perceived, felt needs. He called us to make disciples. What else did we learn? We learned that it was really important for us to pray. And when I say pray, I don't mean in the standard prayer meeting, even though we did have those, but it was pray to seek God. To seek God, to inquire of God, and to seek Him and watch for whatever He was doing. Watch what He was doing in our lives, watch what He was doing in the life of the congregation, and even watch what He's doing in the life of the community. And then maybe we could join Him if we paid attention. But we spent a lot of time in prayer. We learned, again, that involvement in lots of ministries for one person really leads to unbalanced living, and it leads to burnout, which a number of us experienced, not the least of which is our former senior pastor. We learned that if God has not raised up people for a ministry, it's probably not time to do it. And we can train people to do things, but even He has to supply the people and give them a heart to be trained to do a ministry. If He hasn't raised them up, it's probably not right for us.